Part 1. The Enigmatic Teen Emperor, Elagabalus Revealed. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a story from nearly 2,000 years ago. So dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of something warm, and let's float gently back to the sun-baked streets of Rome, where the empire was in full swing, magnificent, chaotic, and just a little bit absurd. We're not racing anywhere. There's no cliffhanger, no sword fights, just the curious, quietly tragic, and sometimes bizarre life of a boy who somehow became emperor before most of us had learned to do laundry without burning water. His name was Elagabalus. And yes, he was, in the traditional sense of history, completely insane. Or at least the historians like to say so. But as always, let's take our time and wander through the oddities, the dynastic weirdness, and the quietly disastrous choices that mark his short life. Elagabalus wasn't born with a crown, of course. He was born Varius Avitus Bassianus in 203 CE in the far eastern reaches of the Roman Empire, in a city with a name as long as a Friday lecture, Emesa, in what is today Syria. The Emesines were famous, or perhaps infamous, for their priestly cult dedicated to a deity known as Elagab, a sort of sun god with a bit of a dramatic flair. His family were hereditary priests, which meant young Varius, before he was even old enough to hold a real conversation, was basically living in a temple with more robes than a fashion runway. And, as one can imagine, being steeped in ritual from infancy probably left him a little peculiar, or in historical terms, prime for imperial chaos. Now, Rome had a habit of adopting far-flung emperors, usually through family ties or sheer political opportunism. In this case, Elagabalus's grandmother, Julia Maesa, decided it was time for the family to reach for the top. She was clever, ruthless in a quiet way, and very patient. The reigning emperor of the time, Caracalla, had a habit of murdering anyone who looked at him the wrong way. So this wasn't exactly a walk in the forum. But Julia Maesa had learned the subtle art of timing, waiting for the right moment to plant her grandson in the seat of absolute power while he was still a teenager. He was 13 when he became emperor, or 14, depending on who you ask, because Roman records are always just a little fuzzy, and why would they waste time on birthdays when the empire had legions to manage and conspiracies to plot? Imagine that. 13. Some of us were still figuring out taxes or how to cook eggs without burning them, and he's suddenly wearing a purple toga, sitting on the golden chair, with senators staring at him like he'd just grown wings. Not exactly the most stable environment for a preteen, but Rome wasn't known for its gentle handling of adolescent rulers. Elagabalus's ascension was helped along by the legions stationed in the east, who were surprisingly cooperative once Julia Maesa promised them wealth and stability. The boy had charisma, or at least the potential for it, but more accurately, he had the backing of a grandmother who understood power in a way most teens couldn't comprehend, even if they tried memorizing Caesar's speeches. The young emperor arrived in Rome with a mixture of ceremonial pomp, exotic cult practices, and a handful of nervous generals who were very concerned about what a teenage sun priest might do next. Now, if you're expecting a story filled with conquest or statecraft, relax. Elagabalus's reign is less about laws and legions, and more about a bizarre parade of personal indulgences, religious experiments, and the peculiarities of someone raised outside the traditional Roman aristocratic system. In other words, he was like a royal teenager with the world's most expensive allowance and too many ceremonial responsibilities. One of the first things he did as emperor was introduce the cult of Elagabal, his childhood sun god, into the very heart of Roman religion. Imagine Rome, a city with centuries of gods, philosophers, and ritual traditions, suddenly having a teenage boy insist that everyone worship the deity he liked best. Temples were rearranged, priests promoted, and ceremonies that combined music, incense, and sun worship became mandatory. Citizens who were generally used to Jupiter or Mars or the occasional mysterious ritual were mostly baffled. But Rome had seen stranger rulers, so it tolerated this with a sort of polite disbelief. Elagabalus was, after all, just a boy playing at divinity. And if the world didn't mind a little chaos in 220 CE, neither did he. Alongside his religious experimentation, Elagabalus also had a reputation for unconventional personal tastes. He was fascinated by luxury, jewelry, exotic foods, and outfits that might make even the most avant-garde modern designers blush. Some sources suggest he wore makeup, wigs, and clothing considered feminine at the time. Now, before we all roll our eyes at historical accounts, because yes, some of it is exaggerated, it's worth noting that Rome was the kind of city that recorded gossip as history. Senators were delighted to write scandalous reports about a young emperor whose fashion sense offended traditionalist sensibilities. And the stories, oh, the stories, did not spare a detail. Elagabalus allegedly wanted to marry a Vestal virgin, an act which was, let's say, politically problematic, and regularly flouted social conventions in ways that made conservative Romans very uncomfortable. But here's the thing. He didn't do it out of cruelty or malice. Mostly he did it because he could, and because the notion of social boundaries was a suggestion rather than a rule for him. The historian Cassius Dio, who spent an inordinate amount of time documenting these indulgences, wrote with a mix of horror and fascination. Modern historians sometimes read these accounts and sigh, because Dio clearly had opinions about good taste and young emperors behaving like rebellious teenagers. And maybe he did. But there's something quietly tragic here. Elagabalus was just a boy, thrust into an adult world of power with very few tools to navigate it without hurting people, or at least scandalizing them. Now, let's float over to another royal disaster, his love life, which, unsurprisingly, made headline gossip for centuries. Elagabalus reportedly married 5 women, divorced several, and also sought relationships with men, going so far as to try and convince one of his lovers to take the role of a wife. This was, of course, a scandalous violation of Roman norms. But it also shows a young person experimenting in the only ways available to him, through the medium of power. Imagine the awkwardness of palace dinners where senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats while the emperor's latest fashion statement, partner, or ceremonial whim unfolded before them. And unlike a modern teenager who might retreat to their bedroom to sulk over parental authority, Elagabalus had an entire empire observing him. Every indulgence, every eccentricity became a spectacle. And this brings us naturally to another point, the governance of the empire. Did he have advisors? Yes. Did he listen to them? Sometimes. Mostly, they were there to navigate his caprices, smooth over public discontent, and occasionally whisper, maybe don't do that. Because yes, some of Elagabalus's choices, like trying to replace Jupiter with a solar deity in the public consciousness, were considered unwise. But Rome had a funny way of surviving the oddities of youth on the throne. Civil unrest, as it turned out, could be managed with coins, parades, and the occasional violent rumor about conspiracies that may or may not have existed. And of course, we can't talk about Elagabalus without mentioning the family intrigue. His grandmother, Julia Mesa, who installed him in the first place, was quietly brilliant. She didn't just put a boy on the throne. She orchestrated a safety net of loyalty, favors, and subtle manipulations that kept him alive longer than one might expect. For a while, she even kept his more reckless tendencies from completely unraveling the state. She was, in essence, the adult supervision he sorely lacked, a slightly sarcastic, very powerful babysitter. And as for Elagabalus himself, there's a subtle melancholy hidden in the stories, because beneath the exotic costumes, the sun worship, the scandalous weddings, and the palace dramas, there was a teenager trying to understand who he was in a world that demanded he be a god, a man, a ruler, and a spectacle, all at once. And sometimes, of course, he failed, sometimes spectacularly, but mostly he just existed in a curious, fragile balance between indulgence and survival, amusement and horror, adolescence and absolute authority. So, as we settle deeper into this warm, almost hypnotic Part 2, Sun Gods, Palace Chaos, and a Teenager on the Throne. Welcome back, everyone. Now that you've had a chance to settle in, maybe stretch your shoulders and sip on something warm, let's drift back to Rome in the year 218 CE, where our young emperor Elagabalus, freshly installed by the strategic brilliance of his grandmother Julia Maesa, was about to turn the Eternal City into a slightly confusing, very fragrant, sun-drenched theater of adolescent experimentation. One of the first things Elagabalus did, and probably the thing he felt most personally important, was make his childhood god, Elagabal, the Syrian sun deity, into the centerpiece of Roman religion. And by centerpiece, I mean replace every other god you've ever heard of. Imagine walking into the Pantheon, a place with centuries of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus quietly looking down, and being told, "Sorry, everyone, we've got a new star in town. His name is Elagabal, and he likes incense, fine robes, and expensive jewelry. Also, please worship him daily." The priests, who had memorized rituals for decades, now had to learn new ones. The public, who had their own casually polytheistic routines, mostly shrugged. And the senators, who were supposed to take this seriously, likely rolled their eyes in unison because why not double down on religious chaos when the empire is already complicated? Elagabalus took this seriously, perhaps a little too seriously. He brought a black stone, supposedly representing his god, from Emesa all the way to Rome. He built a grand temple on the Palatine Hill, the Elagalium, with the subtlety of someone who thought, if I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, so let's make every ritual about me and my sun god. He personally presided over ceremonies, sometimes dressing in elaborate robes that blurred the lines between priest, performer, and teenage emperor having a particularly dramatic mood. It's said he even carried his god's sacred stone in processions, lavishly adorned with gold and jewels, through the streets of Rome. Citizens, naturally, either gawked, whispered to each other, or, most realistically, tried to look busy while avoiding eye contact with the royal parade. Alongside this, Elagabalus loved to blend religion with spectacle. He reportedly held festivals that involved music, dancing, incense, and sometimes exotic animals imported from far corners of the empire. Lions, ostriches, maybe even a camel or two, all under the supervision of a teenager with an eye for drama. The Romans, who were accustomed to occasional bizarre spectacles, tolerated this mostly because it was a slow drift into absurdity rather than a violent upheaval. And the Senate? They spent their days writing letters about his eccentricities, perhaps imagining what life would be like if their own adolescent children suddenly declared themselves divine. Of course, being a young ruler with absolute power isn't only about religion. It's also about experimenting with the palace, with fashion, with relationships, and with the subtle art of making one's subordinates extremely nervous. Elagabalus reportedly had an affinity for ostentatious dress, sometimes wearing jewelry and garments that were considered inappropriate for a male emperor. Some historians even suggest he wore makeup. And before we get too judgmental, remember, teenage rebellion meets absolute power, and suddenly the line between personal expression and imperial scandal becomes rather thin. Then there were the marital and romantic adventures, or misadventures, depending on how you look at them. Elagabalus's love life has been chronicled with all the precision and subtlety of a tabloid. He married several women, divorced a few, and allegedly attempted to arrange marriages with men, seeking partners to act as wives in ways that flustered Roman sensibilities. One of his more famous relationships was with a man named Hierocles, a charioteer or freedman, depending on the account, whom Elagabalus reportedly adored, lavished with gifts and placed in positions of unusual prominence. Senators noted this with disapproval, historians noted it with fascination, and the citizens of Rome probably whispered over dinners, well, that's unusual, but at least it's quiet so far. This all ties into what can politely be called palace chaos. The emperor's whims affected everything, from ceremonial duties to who could sit where in the dining hall. Elagabalus's household was reportedly full of intrigue, confusion, and, yes, extravagant indulgences. Some sources describe him playing pranks on officials, seating them incorrectly during rituals or demanding odd entertainments. He once supposedly released snakes during public performances, though whether this was meant as spectacle, intimidation, or teenage boredom remains unclear. The effect, regardless, was consistent. A palace full of adults who were both terrified and thoroughly bemused by a teenage emperor's choices. Now, you might be thinking, surely Rome cannot survive on eccentricity alone. And you'd be right. Behind the scenes, there were murmurs, whispers, and subtle maneuvers by Julia Maesa. She understood that while her grandson's behaviors were colorful, they were also dangerous. Elagabalus lacked political subtlety. He lacked an understanding of Roman traditionalism. And yet the empire persisted, because power, in those days, was as much about family networks as it was about armies and laws. Julia Maesa and her sister, Julia Sosimius, quietly bided the emperor, managing his impulses and ensuring that the legions remained loyal, even when Rome's senators quietly fantasized about an emperor who might obey convention. One particularly peculiar story involves food. Elagabalus had an almost obsessive fascination with exotic cuisine, sometimes demanding dishes that included ingredients imported from distant provinces. He reportedly served ostriches, peacocks, and other unusual delicacies at feasts. Some sources claim he even enjoyed playing pranks during meals, like seating guests so that they received unexpected portions or were compelled to taste things they would normally avoid. Again, it's less about cruelty and more about the idle curiosity and performance art of a teenager with unlimited resources. Religion, love life, fashion, and food aside, there was also the matter of governance. Elagabalus did appoint ministers and tried to implement certain reforms, although these were often overshadowed by his more dramatic behaviors. He reportedly attempted to elevate his family members to positions of significant power, sometimes to the annoyance of traditional Roman aristocrats. The balancing act between palace drama and imperial administration was delicate, and inevitably cracks began to show. The citizens tolerated eccentricity for a while, but the longer Elagabalus remained in office, the more the whispers of discontent grew. And then there was the matter of succession, which is always awkward in Roman politics. Elagabalus had no children, partly because of his age, partly because his lifestyle was unconventional, and partly because, well, things rarely go smoothly in dynastic histories. This uncertainty, combined with his eccentricities, created an undercurrent of tension. Generals, senators, and palace officials all quietly speculated on the next move, because in Rome, the stability of the empire often depended on whether someone could be quietly removed before disaster struck. As this subtle tension built, the young emperor's behaviors became even more theatrical. Some historians, clearly entertained and horrified, recorded that he would disguise himself and roam the streets of Rome to test citizens' reactions, or play elaborate pranks on officials during public ceremonies. Imagine being a senator, sworn to serve the state, only to find yourself part of a teenager's elaborate social experiment. It's a wonder the empire didn't collapse from laughter, or at least from polite exasperation. Meanwhile, the religious reforms continued unabated. Elagabalus reportedly tried to merge Roman deities with his sun god, creating festivals that combined rituals, music, and dramatic performances that lasted for days. Citizens might have tolerated it at first, but eventually the combination of novelty, expense, and disruption started to wear thin. The palace staff, already juggling the eccentricities of a teenage emperor, now had to manage festivals with exotic animals, imported foods, and increasingly complex ceremonial rules. And then there was the subtle but impactful social messages of his reign. By challenging traditional norms of gender.
Part 3. The Fragile Throne. Conspiracies and the Teen Emperor's Decline. Welcome back, everyone. Now that you're comfortably settled, let's drift slowly through the latter years of Elagabalus's reign. By this point, Rome had adjusted, at least marginally, to the spectacle of a teenage emperor who worshipped a foreign sun god, wore silks, and frequently flouted conventional norms. But even in the most patient empires, indulgence has a shelf life. As much as the citizens tolerated incense, exotic animals, and eccentric ceremonies, the whispers of discontent were beginning to grow louder. And naturally, this is where the quieter, tragic side of history emerges, the unraveling of a young life under pressure, misperceived by history as merely scandalous. The seeds of tension had been planted almost from the start. Elagabalus's elevation to the throne was orchestrated by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who understood political realities far better than her grandson ever could. Her clever manipulation of legions and senatorial loyalty kept him safe initially, but as he grew into his role, or rather his peculiar interpretation of it, he began making decisions that increasingly alienated the very networks that protected him. And Rome, in its subtle, inexorable way, began to show signs of strain under the weight of adolescent rule. One of the most delicate issues was religion, of course. The attempt to elevate the cult of Elagabalus above traditional Roman gods had initially been tolerated as exotic novelty. Citizens could ignore the bizarre rituals, senators could mutter complaints under their breath, and legions could focus on defending the empire instead of evaluating theology. But over time, the insistence on replacing centuries-old practices with sun god ceremonies created subtle but growing resentment. Priests of Jupiter, Mars, and other long-standing deities were quietly offended. Citizens attending festivals may have enjoyed the spectacle initially, but when civic calendars and social expectations were disrupted, tolerance waned. Even the palace staff tasked with managing festivals that sometimes lasted for weeks and involved exotic animals, lavish processions, and intricate ritual choreography began to feel strain. Meanwhile, Elagabalus's personal eccentricities, which had once been entertaining, became politically inconvenient. His relationships, marriages, and romantic pursuits, while perhaps personally meaningful, were scrutinized as evidence of instability. The emperor's fondness for Hierocles, the freedman charioteer, and his attempts to elevate him to a position of prominence was widely mocked by contemporary sources. Historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian, who loved detail, described these choices with a mixture of horror, fascination, and faintly judgmental glee. Senators whispered, legions murmured, and Julia Mesa, ever the pragmatic strategist, quietly intervened when necessary to prevent outright rebellion. But intervention has its limits, and as the years passed, cracks began to appear. The young emperor, despite the loyalty of his grandmother, was still inexperienced and increasingly emboldened by power. He made administrative decisions that were unconventional, to say the least. Some historians suggest he experimented with provincial governance, sometimes appointing officials who were either loyal friends or simply amusing to him, rather than qualified administrators. This caused mild disruptions in tax collection, civic management, and provincial order, which, while not catastrophic, created a sense of unease among Rome's elite. Adding fuel to the subtle fire was the matter of public perception. Rome, a city that tolerated spectacle but valued decorum, began to view Elagabalus as a problem more than a curiosity. His flamboyant displays, exotic rituals, and romantic adventures, which once amused, began to unsettle senators, magistrates, and even military commanders. The young emperor, blissfully unaware, or perhaps indifferent, continued his performances. Public banquets, religious processions, and palace theatrics increased in scale and complexity, sometimes to the point of inconvenience. Imagine living next door to someone who decides every evening must feature a parade of exotic animals, ceremonial music, and personal appearances. That's roughly how the citizens felt. By 221 CE, the tension reached a subtle tipping point. Julia Mesa, recognizing the growing discontent, began quietly positioning her family for contingency measures. She understood that absolute power exercised by a teenager, even a fascinatingly unusual one, could not be sustained indefinitely. Political networks began to form behind the scenes. Senators who quietly opposed Elagabalus, military officers who questioned the emperor's judgment, and distant relatives of previous emperors who nursed their own claims to legitimacy. Rome, always patient but quietly observant, was preparing for change. It's important to note that at this stage there was no open rebellion, no dramatic uprising. The empire's survival relied on careful maneuvering, subtle conspiracies, and whispers in corridors. The legions, still loyal due to Mysa's influence and generous promises, were hesitant to act hastily, but the political ecosystem had shifted. Elagabalus's choices, personal, religious, and administrative, had created a sense of uncertainty that, if unchecked, could cascade into crisis. And then there was the emperor's increasingly unpredictable personal life. By now, his romantic relationships were deeply intertwined with politics. Hierocles, as mentioned, was granted unusual influence, which alienated traditionalists in the Senate. Elagabalus's multiple marriages, divorces, and attempts to elevate partners to quasi-official roles became sources of gossip, mockery, and quiet alarm. Senators reportedly joked in letters that the emperor treated Rome as a stage for personal amusement, and, in a sense, this was true. The young ruler's adolescence was on display to the entire empire, and not everyone was comfortable watching. At the same time, Elagabalus's fascination with ceremonial display continued unabated. Festivals honoring Elagabalus, processions through the streets, and exotic rituals became more elaborate. Some sources claim he even combined elements of Roman gods with his sun deity, creating hybrid ceremonies that baffled priests, citizens, and historians alike. And as these public performances grew, so did the whispers of opposition, because human nature, especially in Rome, tends to resist change imposed from above, particularly when that change is flamboyant and personally driven. As we drift slowly through this period, it's worth reflecting on the human side of these events.
Elagabalus, despite the chaos and scandal, was still a teenager attempting to navigate absolute authority. He experimented, expressed curiosity, sought love, and pursued identity in ways that clashed with tradition. His failures were as much the product of inexperience as of personal eccentricity. And yet, the empire around him, though resilient, was increasingly strained by the collision of youthful whimsy and centuries-old expectations. In 222 CE, the situation finally reached a climax. Political conspiracies, long brewing, crystallized into decisive action. Julia Mesa, ever pragmatic, decided that her grandson's survival and the continued influence of their family required a careful, if uncomfortable, intervention. Sources suggest she quietly encouraged military and senatorial support for a transition of power, positioning Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander, as a more traditional and stable alternative. The decision was subtle. As always, no massive battles, no dramatic speeches, simply the quiet alignment of key figures who controlled loyalty, influence, and force. Elagabalus, perhaps unaware of the full scope of the conspiracy, continued his rituals, processions, and personal indulgences. The contrast between his personal world of ceremonial spectacle and the growing political reality of opposition was striking. On one hand, the emperor lived in silk robes, presiding over festivals, entertaining companions, and delighting in exotic displays. On the other, the machinery of Roman governance was quietly shifting beneath him, preparing for the inevitable. The final act, as historians narrate, was brief and subdued, rather than sensational. Elagabalus's reign, marked by curiosity, experimentation, and youthful indulgence, was quietly brought to an end by those closest to him. His grandmother's strategy ensured that the transition of power would preserve family influence while addressing the empire's need for stability. It's a subtle, almost sleepy conclusion to a reign that might otherwise have seemed chaotic. Absolute power exercised by a teenager, gradually corrected through quiet political maneuvering rather than dramatic force. Reflecting on Elagabalus's story, we see a mixture of scandal, eccentricity, and human vulnerability. He was a teenager in a world of absolute responsibility, attempting to reconcile identity, devotion, and curiosity with the rigid expectations of Rome. His failures were amplified by circumstance, youth, and the impossibility of pleasing both gods and citizens. Yet in the Part 4, The Gentle End, Downfall and Legacy of the Teen Emperor. Welcome back, everyone. By now, you've drifted along through temples, festivals, palace intrigues, and the curious romances of one of Rome's most unusual emperors. We're now arriving at the quieter, more melancholy chapter of Elagabalus's story. The final days of a teenage reign, the subtle collapse of authority, and the lingering echoes that made his life a historical curiosity for centuries to come. So, settle in, maybe take a slow breath, and let's meander gently toward the end. By 222 CE, the empire had grown increasingly restless. Elagabalus's flamboyant ceremonies, eccentric rituals, and unconventional personal choices, while endlessly fascinating to historians, had tested the patience of senators, magistrates, and even military leaders. The subtle tension between youthful indulgence and imperial expectation had now reached a tipping point. The quiet conspiracies that had been brewing in corridors and palaces began to crystallize into decisive, though still relatively discreet, action. The key figure in this transition was Julia Mesa, the grandmother who had installed Elagabalus on the throne. She had always been the pragmatic counterpart to her grandson's exuberance, quietly steering the empire's machinery while he explored the limits of power. By now, she recognized that the time had come to act decisively.
not with spectacle, not with violence at first, but with careful alignment of loyalty. The legions, whose allegiance had been cultivated through wealth, promises, and careful influence, were prepared to support a more conventional, stabilizing figure, Severus Alexander, Elagabalus' cousin. Elagabalus, still immersed in his own world of ceremonial performance, probably did not fully grasp the political maneuverings around him. He continued to preside over festivals, to worship Elagabal with solemn devotion and dramatic flair, and to indulge in personal pleasures with the single-minded focus of a teenager accustomed to getting everything he wanted. His public appearances, full of silk robes, music, incense, and exotic animals, carried on almost as if nothing was changing. And yet, the undercurrent of discontent was real and quietly decisive. Eventually, the transition moved from subtle alignment to decisive action. Reports suggest that palace officials and military commanders quietly withdrew their support from Elagabalus, effectively isolating him. The young emperor, so accustomed to admiration and indulgence, found himself suddenly vulnerable. His authority, which had always relied heavily on loyalty, cultivated through spectacle, persuasion, and family influence, now faced the cold calculation of those who prioritized stability over novelty. As historians describe it, the end was swift. Elagabalus was assassinated in a palace coup, along with his mother, Julia Soaemius, who had also been influential behind the scenes. The accounts vary slightly. Some emphasize the brutality, others the efficiency, but the common thread is the quiet inevitability of the outcome. Rome had tolerated spectacle and eccentricity for a time, but adulthood, when combined with absolute power, eventually collided with the pragmatic requirements of empire. Interestingly, the historical aftermath was almost as fascinating as the reign itself. Elagabalus's body was treated with a mix of disdain and erasure. Historians note that the Senate and later chroniclers sought to minimize his influence, emphasizing scandal and indulgence while neglecting to mention any subtle achievements or curiosities. And yet the very details of his life, the rituals, the festivals, the dramatic personal choices, ensured that his story persisted. It became a sort of cautionary tale, but also a human story. A teenager trying, in the only ways he knew, to find identity and meaning in a world that demanded perfection and conformity. The transition to Severus Alexander was smooth, at least in comparison. Julia Mace's careful orchestration ensured continuity, the legions remained loyal, and the empire avoided immediate chaos. In a way, Elagabalus's downfall was also a testament to the quiet brilliance of his grandmother, whose ability to manage politics behind the scenes contrasted sharply with his grandson's flamboyant, public-facing experimentation. As we reflect on Elagabalus's reign, it's worth considering the dualities that defined it. On one hand, he was scandalous, unconventional, and arguably irresponsible by traditional Roman standards. He experimented with religion, fashion, sexuality, and ceremony in ways that unsettled the elite. On the other hand, he was deeply human. A teenager thrust into unimaginable power, seeking identity, affection, and curiosity in a world that demanded perfection and conformity. His religious experiments, while controversial, reveal a young person trying to reconcile personal belief with inherited authority. His personal relationships, equally unconventional, show the search for connection and affection in the corridors of power. And his ceremonial indulgences, the music, incense, and exotic processions, reflect the need for expression in an environment that could otherwise feel isolating and overwhelming. In the soft light of history, these eccentricities are less a sign of inherent failure than of the inevitable challenges faced by someone so young, so isolated, and so powerful. The legacy of Elagabalus, then, is subtle and layered. He is remembered as bizarre, indulgent, and unconventional, but he also exemplifies the vulnerability of youth under absolute authority. Modern historians, reflecting on his life, often approach it with a mixture of fascination, empathy, and gentle incredulity. How does a teenager navigate the expectations of divinity, governance, and tradition? Elagabalus's life provides a quietly compelling answer. With experimentation, indulgence, occasional missteps, and ultimately a poignant mixture of tragedy and curiosity. It's also worth noting the peculiar endurance of his story. Centuries later, Elagabalus continues to appear in historical accounts not because he conquered the empire, reformed the laws, or achieved military glory, but because of the human drama, the theatricality, and the subtle tragedies of his reign. He reminds us that history is not only made by victories and reforms, but also by eccentricity, failure, and the quiet struggles of individuals navigating power beyond their years. As we conclude this gentle exploration, imagine the soft, sunlit corridors of the Palatine Palace once more. Picture a teenager in silk robes, perhaps arranging flowers for ritual, adjusting the incense for his god, listening to music, or tending to a favorite companion. Imagine the nervous attendants, the bemused senators, and the loyal legions all observing quietly. Elagabalus's life, short and unconventional, was a blend of human curiosity, ceremonial spectacle, and fragile authority. And in that quiet blend lies the reason we remember him,